So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yeshayahu the prophet, we always then ask the question, why then Israel has destroyed its own prophets? And then we should ask ourselves also, how came the scriptures were then recorded during the time of the events, or was then much later? So obviously it was much later that it was recorded, and then it was an oral tradition of then reciting then the instructions, and then people then later on began the quest of writing. But then as times and the seasons and generations after, then there are political problems, and then people, by the time they begin to write the holy instructions, there are lots of changes in editing to fit the political purposes of the time. Let's give an example of these. As far as the Goliath, or then David and Goliath's fight, for instance, it is commonly known that the situation as far as Goliath, he did not have the set of armor described by the instructions or the scriptures, is highly, extremely beyond what then the people found in the city of Gath. So the city of Gath was then found, and it was then the hometown of Goliath, and they used to have an army over there. It can barely find any kind of army metal, and these should give us some understanding that the round shield and then the entire armor that Goliath was using, it's because of the Hebrews then, when they were in exile, they began to change the instructions in order to favor those people who conquered them. So as far as what we read from the holy instructions, it is extremely important for us then to read these and then understand the times and the seasons and properly interpret these instructions. Let's give another example. For instance, Ibrahim, he was the first man of this earth that had a relationship with the Almighty Creator. He was then the very person who was endowed with understanding. He then fought a war, and also he went to Egypt, and he was given then many mates, and Hagar was an Egyptian mate. He then received her as his own property. And then later on, because of Sarah, she could not bear children, she decided on her own to take on the responsibility of giving then Hagar. But then there is a situation going on, because Hagar and Ishmael, they were not thrown out of the tent. That's the very big problem. So let's verify this situation then. When a person reads from the instructions, or even the Quran if you want to glance at it, you find then when a person then is chosen as a scapegoat, you don't find a person later on then becoming prosperous. As far as Hagar and Ishmael, they lived together with Ibrahim and Sarah during the entire life of Ishmael until after he was roughly some 40 years old. Then he had the age capacity of making decisions, then later on bearing a family, and then later on he received then what Ibrahim received as spoils of war. And he received then his inheritance, and then he was able to start up his own trade company. He was simply a person involved with transportation and trade amongst the nations. Now you have to have a very strong family tie in order for you to understand the family understanding of the Middle East. Now, if you take a person who is absolutely cast out, thrown out in the desert with his mother and having no water, and then coming up with some story of some angel came up from heaven, it doesn't fit. The presence of the Creator was in the tent of Ibrahim because of the Creator himself had chosen Ibrahim. Then because of him, he then had the first son, Ishmael, and they lived together. Ishmael then, when he was roughly 40 years old, he received his inheritance, and he was able to make adult decisions for his own life. So then, later on, Ibrahim felt that his pilgrimage had to continue on. So then, Ishmael and Hagar, they went out and they set for themselves then a plan. And then Ibrahim and Sarah continue on their pilgrimage. So then Ishmael started out as a child. He was a king. So he was never thrown out. There was never problems in a tent as is described. It was invention of the Hebrews when they began to record the instructions. They made it up stories in order to fit themselves in society. So then, because of this factor, let's then evaluate some of the areas where then the Muslim world, for instance, or Islam, why they are so prominent in this world, because the Creator himself had chosen Ibrahim and said to him that he was going to multiply then his sons and obviously daughters in this entire world. Now you can't have such a multiplication when a person is rejected. So Ishmael was never rejected. There was no angel that came out from heaven and showed up in the desert. Moses, later on, what he saw was in his vision while he was resting. He went out in the desert. He was trying to find an animal over there that went out from his herd. And he was so tired of trying to find the animal, he simply lay down and he rested for a while. And he had this understanding of then the Creator showing up to him in a burning bush and so on and so forth. So we must separate what is mysticism and what is reality. There are some sections, for instance, of the Hebrew parasha stating then the Creator himself had given manna to his people, and it is true. Those wafers that came down from heaven and had a taste like honey and whatever they want to believe the taste was, and then rained down jewelry and precious stones from heaven. What a piece of crap of understanding of having jewels raining down from heaven. You have to be joking. And a lot of people in the congregations, they let this kind of a crap goes on. But as far as we can understand from the instructions, then Ishmael was a child very much loved. He was very much cared for. It is true that Sarah had a limited emotional link with the child because she was not the real mother. And for many years she felt aside. But Ibrahim had control over his tent. And then when came roughly 40 years old, at the age of the child, then the child was able then to make decisions. He decided then having a caravan trade type of service, type of work. And this gives us the understanding later on when Joseph was then sold into slavery, went to Egypt. He sold into a caravan of the Ishmaelites. So they were very prominent on the land. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think the Creator then was behind a scheme of throwing out a maidservant with a child very early in life in the midst of a hot burning desert? If your character believes this kind of a story, then you may not fit regarding either the Quran, the Holy Quran, or the Holy Instructions of the Hebrews, or the Torah. The Creator would never let this boy in such a young age with his mother to be thrown in a desert, in a burning desert. So obviously, the Creator himself had closed the womb of Sarah in order for the boy to become then later on an advanced child, became a man, and then he set out in his own life and he started his own company. However, then Hagar went with him. And Ibrahim and Sarah then started on and continue on with their pilgrimage. Thus then, later on, became in tabernacling. So as far as what the world is going to do with this absolutely simple truth, this truth that is so immensely enormous, and then reteaching the people the very steps, simple steps of the character of the Creator. He would never thrown out a mother with a tiny child in the midst of a burning desert. It simply does not make any sense. I'm going to later on explain more of this situation, so please stay tuned, much more coming up.